Is the American dream flourishing in China? China is still a much more poor country than the United States. But the Chinese have taken a commanding lead in the most intangible but the most valuable of economic indicators: optimism. In a nation marked by the lingering impact of the Cultural Revolution and strict control over politics by an authoritarian government, the Chinese people are surprisingly optimistic. Recent public opinion surveys shows they are more hopeful about the future than Americans and Europeans. What changed? Home ownership has been called the quintessential American dream. Yet today, less than 65% of American homes are owner-occupied, and more than 50% of the equity in those homes is owned by the banks. Compare China, where despite facing one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world, a whopping 90% of families can afford to own their homes. In the past 10 years, American wages have mostly stayed the same, and China has consistently been more productive than the United States. To address this issue, the U.S. government has started a trade war and imposed high taxes to punish China for what it sees as unfair trade practices. The belief is that China's government supports its industries, keeping their costs low, which allows them to sell inexpensive products in the U.S. This, in turn, lowers prices but also puts American companies at a disadvantage, potentially leading to their closure. There's a common perception that Chinese workers endure tough conditions for very low pay, almost like they're being exploited or working in conditions similar to slavery. In China, 90% of families own the homes that they live in, making it one of the highest rates of home ownership in the entire world. What's even more noteworthy is that 80% of these homes are fully owned, meaning there are no mortgages or other debts that are tied to them. Additionally, over 20% of city households own more than one home. Because of their communist history, Chinese families technically have long-term leaseholds instead of perpetual ownership. And the construction quality of these houses might not be top-notch. However, the key question is, how can Chinese families manage to afford these homes, especially in a country where the average income is only about 1/7 of that in the United States? Some analysts attribute this trend to cultural distinctions. Chinese individuals have a strong inclination for saving, with household saving rates surpassing those in the US by more than double. They allocate a significant portion, up to 74%, of their income towards housing. During China's previous one-child policy, many families had only one male heir, and owning a home became a prerequisite for finding a spouse. Consequently, families would pool their resources to ensure their sole heir was well prepared for this competition. Homes were often purchased with substantial down payments or without any financing, as using banks for loans with compound interest could double the overall cost of a typical mortgage. Thus, bypassing traditional bank financing can effectively cut housing expenses in half. While cultural factors do play a role, they alone do not account for the contrast in home ownership rates between the two nations. The average middle-class American family would struggle to purchase a home outright for their eldest heir, even with pooled resources, as they have various other financial commitments. The key distinction in family wealth between China and the US lies in the cost of living. In China, simply put, the expenses are notably lower. The Chinese government provides substantial subsidies, not only for industries but also for families, including support for education, healthcare, and even transportation. This financial assistance contributes significantly to making home ownership much more feasible for Chinese families. As per an old 2017 HSBC fact sheet, an impressive 70% of Chinese millennials aged 19 to 36 already own homes. In contrast, many young Americans face challenges in purchasing homes due to student debt burdens, averaging about $37,000 per student and taking an average of 20 years to repay. A recent survey revealed that 80% of American workers are living paycheck to paycheck, and another study found that 60% of U.S. millennials couldn't come up with $500 to cover their own tax bills. These financial pressures contribute to the disparity in homeownership rates between Chinese and American millennials. Unlike in the U.S., student debt is nearly non-existent in China. Generous government subsidies have made higher education affordable, allowing students to work part-time jobs to pay their way through college. Government subsidies also extend to healthcare, with a state-run health insurance program akin to Canada's. While not covering all expenses, medical costs remain significantly lower in China than in the U.S. Additionally, public transportation in China is not only affordable, but actually really fast, really efficient, and hugely accessible. These subsidized services contribute to the overall lower cost of living in China compared to the financial challenges faced by many in the United States. The income disparity between American and Chinese workers can be quite misleading for several reasons. The average income in the U.S. encompasses both the very wealthy and the poor, and the gap between these two classes is more substantial than in China. The disproportionately large incomes at the top end up elevating the overall average in the U.S. However, what's even worse is the disparity in debt levels, which pulls disposable income down. A survey after the 2008-2009 credit crisis found that household debt in the U.S. was 136% of household income, compared to only 17% for the Chinese. A huge contrast lies in the fact that 70% of Chinese family wealth is derived not from salaries but directly from home ownership. During the era of communism, all real property belonged to the state. When Deng Xiaoping introduced market-oriented reforms, allowing private ownership, families seized the chance to acquire homes under these favorable conditions. As new homes were constructed, families engaged in trading upwards, effectively expanding their asset base through this process of home ownership. Deng Xiaoping's market liberalization not only facilitated home ownership, but also provided families with an income boost by enabling them to become entrepreneurs. This period saw the emergence of new family-owned businesses supported by accessible and even affordable loans. State-owned banks played a role in this economic landscape by providing cheap credit, which not only subsidized state-affiliated industries, but also helped to contribute to the growth of private enterprises. China's government has been supporting its economy by investing a lot of money over the past few decades. This is different from the United States, where the Federal Reserve puts money into big banks. In China, the stimulus money goes into things like helping local businesses and building infrastructure. This approach, often referred to as qualitative easing or quantitative easing with Chinese characteristics, has led to more jobs, increased GDP, which is the total value of goods and services produced, and means more money for more people to spend. Overall, this has improved everybody's quality of life in China. China's government has been able to achieve economic growth without accumulating a huge national debt or causing out-of-control inflation. Over the past 2 decades, the amount of money in circulation in China, M2 money supply, has surged recently from just over 10 trillion yuan to 80 trillion yuan, which is about 11.6 trillion US dollars, marking an almost 800% increase. Surprisingly, the inflation rate as measured by the Consumer Price Index, commonly seen as CPI, has remained quite low. In February of 2019, it was only 1.5%, and in May of 2019, when it rose to 2.7% due to an outbreak of swine fever causing pork prices to spike, it was a response to shortages rather than an increase in the money supply. The key reason behind this is that China's economy has been expanding rapidly, with the increase in goods and services matching the rise in the money supply. As a result, supply and demand have increased together, preventing a significant surge in consumer prices. Over the past 2 decades, real estate prices in China have surged by 325%, largely due to the influence of a shadow banking system that operates with limited regulatory oversight. Some experts express concerns about a potential housing bubble in China, similar to the situation in the US before the 2008 financial crisis, when there were risky, no doc, no down kind of loans. However, the Chinese housing market is considered much more stable. Unlike the US, where buyers could get loans without providing documentation or making a down payment, Chinese buyers typically contributed 40 to 50% of the home's value up front, making the home market much more secure. Despite these warnings, there's still a strong demand for houses in China. To address potential risks, the central bank is taking measures to cool down the real estate market. One such strategy involves directing credit away from real estate and over to other existing assets and towards the production of new goods and new services. This aims to balance the market and prevent excessive speculation in the housing sector. The way that the People's Bank of China intervenes in the economy highlights a key difference between Chinese-style qualitative easing and the Western style of quantitative easing, commonly seen as QE. In the West, central banks oftentimes engage in QE to boost liquidity in the banking sector, enabling banks to lend out more money. However, in China, this form of QE is not considered necessary. Chinese banks are already active lenders, and the central bank has ample control over interest rates and the money supply itself. Instead of focusing on the banking sector, China's central bank directs credit to the local economy. The reason behind this approach is a lack of trust in the private financial market's ability to allocate credit where it's needed in local markets. The People's Bank in China is actually quite true to its name, as it appears to function more as a people's bank, prioritizing the service of the overall economy and the overall public, rather than solely benefiting the banks themselves. This distinctive approach sets it apart from the Western central banking practices. In the US, the idea behind more quantitative easing, expanding the money supply, could be beneficial if it allowed the Chinese-style qualitative easing approach. If the US were to adopt a form of monetary expression similar to China's, it could then enable Congress to address pressing issues, such as high medical and high educational costs. Additionally, it could provide affordable credit to states for infrastructure upgrades in things like roads and mass transit, and then offer support as well to local businesses. This approach might contribute to enhancing the competitiveness of American workers compared to their Chinese counterparts. The emphasis would be on using monetary policy to support broader economic factors and the well-being of the public. China's government supports its workers and its industries, which is different from how the US operates. Instead of criticizing China for this approach, maybe the United States could learn from it. China's history is rooted in socialism, and even as it engages in international trade, it continues to prioritize the well-being of its workers. On the other hand, the US is sometimes seen as moving towards a system that resembles feudalism, with workers facing consistently tough conditions and consistent debt. Here in the 21st century, there's an opportunity to update our economic model. Rather than exploiting workers, we could aim for a cooperative democracy. This means acknowledging the needs, the contributions, and rights of everyone involved in the economy. It is a shift towards a more collaborative and a more fair way of doing things.